So I think for us, we do have a somewhat different terminology for millennials, and this is not to confuse everybody. We call this Generation 2, and we call this Generation 2 because we think it's quite important to contrast this versus Generation 1. Generation 1 being the first generation when money started flowing in China, and that's my generation. So I was born in 1970. I graduated from university in 1992. So that's a year after Deng Xiaoping's Nanxun, right? Sort of Deng Xiaoping's tour of the South China. So that's when money started to flow. So I'm the first generation when money is actually available in China. So it's quite important to understand the Generation 2 or the millennials. Actually, they grew up in an environment where the previous generation, so my generation and my parents' generation, have already accumulated material wealth in a household, right? So the psychology of this generation is heavily influenced by the material basis already accumulated in the society, already accumulated in the households. So I think it's important for us to understand also the behavior of Generation 1 so that we can appreciate the difference in Generation 2 or millennials. So on this chart, you basically see the household asset allocation in the US and also in China, right? So I think what's striking is that in China, a significant proportion of the asset allocation goes into real estate, goes into property. So that's a Generation 1 psychology, right? So for my generation, the first thing when you have money, you try to build a nest. You try to buy a home. You try to buy something that sort of will be there for the future generations. So therefore, because of that, because a lot of our wealth is tied up in illiquid real estate properties, the propensity to spend is actually not that strong, right? So therefore, that's why you see people are concerned about price, people are only trying to look for value products. But as you see in the United States, and also I think you would see the same thing in Japan, the post-Tokyo Olympics generation is, I would think, very much like the Generation 2 in China, because they also grew up in a period where their parents have already bought, right, the house or the apartment, and also they already live in a society where the infrastructure is sufficiently developed. So their propensity to spend is much more than the Generation 1 in Japan. And so if you compare also then China versus US, obviously in the US, the proportion of asset allocation towards property and real estate is also significantly less than in China. So I think it's very important to keep this in mind when we think about what is different about the millennials in China versus the millennials in the United States, for example. I think obviously the technology change, a lot of these things are important, but it's also important that millennials in China coincide with Generation 2, where the psychology of this generation is significantly different from Generation 1. Again, every time I speak about millennials, I use myself as an example. I grew up, the first 10 years of my life, 1970 to 1980. I was born in Shanghai, but I grew up in Xi'an. So it's obviously a northwestern or central China, depends on how you define that city. So in the first 10 years of my life, eating meat was a single-digit event every year. Right, so it's not even over 10 times every year. It's a single-digit event. So basically, only around major holidays or festivals, we go to a place called Xi'an Fanzhuang, like a Xi'an, the Grand Xi'an Hotel, and you would queue up, right, and buy those really fatty porks, right, that people today will probably not eat, but at those times, those would be the only animal protein that we would actually intake on an annual basis. So obviously, my generation. Sort of, our attitudes and psychology towards what constitutes happiness is very different from a Generation 2. But then also says, for Generation 2, we believe, or millennials, they will behave increasingly like a global consumer. So whereas, in the past, we say Chinese consumers are very different, we actually think the next generation of consumers in China will behave in a more global way. I guess you can call that glocal or whatever, but more global way versus the first generation, because the sort of the environment they grew up in is very different. And so I think this chart just talks about China's household consumption being obviously always depressed, but I think it's also important to see that if you add consumption plus housing purchase is actually relatively flat, right? So I think it's always to remember that for generation one, it's primarily about long cycle consumption. We buy houses, we buy apartments, we buy even automobiles, right? Automobile relative to shampoos is obviously long cycle consumption, but we felt that going forward, millennials, because their parents have already accumulated the long cycle consumptions, short cycle consumption going forward is going to become much more important. And this is another data point for everyone to just, to reflect on. United States and China, when you look at the real estate market size, it's about the same, right? The left-hand side is the real estate market size in the US and also in China, relative to obviously still a quite different overall macro economy size. US is still much bigger than China in terms of total GDP, but if you look at the property market size, China is already the same as the US. But if you look at retail sales, excluding property sales, US is still 35% higher than in China. So I think what we're seeing today is really a reflection of sort of combination of millennials and the pre-millennials consumer group in the market. So today, in 2012, the generation 2 or millennial loosely defined account for about 15% of the total consumption. But going forward, this is going to increase by 2020 to 35%, right? So I think what we're seeing in the market is really a mixed sort of reflection of generation 1, you could even say generation 0, generation 1, and also generation 2. So that's why, as Clay was saying, sometimes it's difficult to generalize about China. It's certainly difficult to generalize about China when we talk about generation 0, 1, and 2 mixed together. But I think increasingly, some of our clients, consumer and retail companies, I think what they're seeing is a growing portion of their target consumers becoming much less purely price sensitive, much less looking towards quality and other emotional factors as a key driver in deciding what to buy. In fact, for a lot of the retailers that we deal with, I think they are increasingly now saying, whereas in the past, the Walmart type of sort of pile them high and sell them cheap model works the best in China. I think a lot of them are increasingly saying the next generation is probably looking for something quite different from a hypermarket type of value model. They're increasingly looking for individual taste. And we do have a few sort of survey results. I'm sure it's hopefully consistent with the Fudan study as well. When we look at generation 1 and generation 2 in terms of their attitudes towards life. And we certainly see that generation 2 consumers are particularly individualistic. In terms of, it is important to have my own perspective. Generation 1, generation 2, the percentage of respondents who agree with statement is markedly different. Generation 2, close to 60%, believing having my own perspective is important. And in terms of following big brands, my generation and my previous generation would think that Louis Vuitton is the brand you need to carry to communicate your value. But the current generation, a lot less of the current generation, or the millennial generation, would actually think in the same way, right? So it's 63% versus 33% in terms of how important it is to use or pick or buy big brands relative to niche brands, individual lifestyle brands that really express myself, right? So that's a huge generational difference. The other thing is, in terms of how do we value time, for my generation, I think a lot of us would actually go to a hypermarket, despite that it's very time-consuming, but because we felt that hypermarket offers a better value, they would really sacrifice time in order to get that value, right? The next generation will be very different. And also, in terms of quality versus price, on the right-hand side, the trade-off is also quite different. So I think, anyway, there can be a lot of similar data that shows the same trend, but I think it's really important for us to understand that whereas we're looking at China today, a lot of us are looking at China in the rear-view mirror, in the sense that we're really looking at the sort of Chinese market or Chinese consumers because the larger proportion of that is still Generation 1, Generation 0 consumers. But I think it's quite important to remember going forward, in 5 years, 10 years' time, we'll be increasingly living in a millennial-dominated society and also market. So therefore, the way we think about societal issues, cultural issues, or even for my clients, economic business issues, will increasingly have to be reoriented towards a very different China, because we are already now, money has been flowing for a few generations, right? So going forward, China, we believe, will increasingly behave more like a global advanced economy when it comes to consumer behavior relative to the different China that we've seen in the past.